Good afternoon. I hope everybody has enjoyed our day so far. We've just heard from great authors, Richard Bausch, George Singleton, a really great panel discussion on Southern literature with Steve Yarborough and Michelle Stone. And I hope if you didn't get a chance to catch these, you will check out our YouTube channel next week when we get the recordings up. You definitely don't want to miss them. So today we are welcoming our keynote speaker, Natasha Trethewey. She's icing on the cake for us today. Natasha was born in Gulfport, Mississippi, spent a lot of time, grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, and she earned her MA in English and creative writing from University of Georgia, near home, and then her MA in English and Creative Writing from Hollins University, and earned an MFA in Poetry from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. We are excited to have her. She's a U.S. Poet Laureate for 2 years, twice, and a Pulitzer Prize winner for her book, Poetry Native Guard. And she is going to talk with us a bit today about her latest book, Memorial Drive, which is a memoir, and definitely just speaks to the influence she's had as a writer and the trauma that she has gone through. I'll also mention that she has had fellowships from Academy of American Poets, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Guggenheim Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, and the Beinecke Library at Yale, the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard. So, and great amount of awards. So very acclaimed, and we're just delighted to have you, Natasha. So welcome, and tell us a little bit about what you have going on and about Memorial Drive.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Linda, and thank you all for joining in. I am going to read today a little bit from the memoir with a little bit of poetry mixed in as well. Memorial Drive is very much a book about grief, about becoming a writer, and the abiding love between a mother and child. One of the things you'll hear is how often I return to certain images, photographs, as well as other scenes that live in my memory. I'm going to start with the opening of Memorial Drive and then read a little bit from the prologue and from the first chapter. 3 weeks after my mother is dead, I dream of her. We walk a rutted path, an oval track around which we are making our slow revolution. Side by side, so close our shoulders nearly touch, neither of us speaking, both of us in our traces. Though I know she is dead, I have a sense else to which I've journeyed to meet her. The world around us is dim, a backdrop of shadows out of which now a man comes. Even in the dream, I know what he has done, and yet I smile, lifting my hand and speaking a greeting as he passes. It's then that my mother turns to me, then that I see it, a hole the size of a quarter in the center of her forehead. From it comes a light so bright, so piercing, that I suffer the kind of momentary blindness brought on by staring at the sun, her face nothing but light ringed in darkness when she speaks. Do you know what it means to have a wound that never heals? I know I am not meant to answer, and so we walk on as before, rounding the path until we meet him again. This time, he's come to finish what he started. Holding a gun, he is aiming at her head. This time, I think I can save her. Is it enough to throw myself in the bullet's path, shout no? I wake to that single word, my own voice wrenching me from sleep. But it's my mother's voice that remains, her last question to me. Do you know what it means to have a wound that never heals? A refrain. The last image of my mother, but for the photographs taken of her body at the crime scene, is the formal portrait made only a few months before her death. She sat for it in a mass market studio known for its competent but unremarkable pictures. Babies coaxed to laughter by hand puppets, children in stair-step formation wearing matching Christmas sweaters, all against a common backdrop. Sometimes it's a sky blue scrim that looks as if it's been brushed with a feather, or an autumn scene of red and yellow leaves framing a post and rail fence. For moodier portraits, as if to convey a sense of seriousness or formal elegance, there's the plain black scrim. She was 40 years old. For the sitting, she'd chosen a long-sleeved black sheath, the high collar open at the throat. She does not look at the camera, her eyes fixed at a point in the distance that seems to be just beyond my head, making her face as inscrutable as it always was. Her high, elegant forehead, smooth and unlined, a billboard upon which nothing is written. Nor does she smile, which makes the cleft in her chin more pronounced, her jawline softly squared above her slender neck. She sits perfectly erect without looking forced or uncomfortable. Perhaps she intended to look back on it years later and say, "That's where it began, my new life." I am struck with the thought that this is what she must have meant to do, document herself as a woman come this far, the rest of her life ahead of her. Hindsight makes me see the portrait differently now. How gloomy it is, as if the photographer meant to produce something artistic rather than an ordinary studio portrait. It's as if he made of the negative space around her a frame to foreground some difficult knowledge, the dark past behind her, her face lit toward a future upon which her gaze is fixed. And yet, undeniably, something else is there. Elegiac even then, a strange corner of light just behind her head, perhaps the photographer's mistake, appearing as though a doorway has opened, a passage through which, turning, she might soon depart. Looking at it now, with all I know of what was to come, I see what else the photographer has done. He shot her like this, her black dress black as the scrim behind her, so that, but for her face, she is in fact part of that darkness, emerging from it as from the depths of memory. Nearly 30 years after my mother's death, I went back for the first time to the place she was murdered. I'd not been there since the year I turned 19, when I had to clean out her apartment, disposing of everything I could not or would not carry with me. All the furniture and household items, her clothing, her large collection of records. I kept only a few of her books, a heavy belt made of bullets, and a single plant she had loved, a Dieffenbachia. Throughout my childhood, it had been my responsibility to tend it every week, dusting and misting the upper leaves and snipping the browned lower ones. Be careful when you handle it, my mother warned, a small precaution seemingly unnecessary, but there is a toxin in the sap of the Dieffenbachia. It oozes from the leaves and the stems where they are cut. Dumb cane, the plant is called, because it can cause a temporary inability to speak. Struck dumb, we say, when fear or shock or astonishment renders us mute. Dumb grief, when the grief is not expressed in uttered words. I could not then grasp the inherent metaphor of the plant, my relationship with my mother, what it would mean that she had made its care my duty while warning me of its danger. When I left Atlanta, vowing never to return, I took with me what I had cultivated all those years, mute avoidance of my past, silence and willed amnesia buried deep in me like a root. Nor could I have anticipated then that anything would ever draw me back to that city, to a geography that held at every turn a reminder of a past I was determined to forget, even as I tried to honor her memory in every way I knew how. Indeed, going back for work after accepting a university faculty position, I thought I could circumvent my former life, going out of my way to avoid at least the one place I could not bear to see, until I had to. To get there, I had to drive past landmarks that took me back to 1985, the county courthouse where the trials were held, the train station from which my mother traveled downtown to work, the DeKalb County Police Station at the intersection of Highway 285, the bypass loop around Metro Atlanta, and make my way down Memorial Drive, a major east-west artery once named Fair Street. It originates in the middle of the city, Memorial, and winds east from downtown, ending at Stone Mountain, the nation's largest monument to the Confederacy. A lasting metaphor for the white mind of the South, Stone Mountain rises out of the ground like the head of a submerged giant, the nostalgic dream of Southern heroism and gallantry emblazoned on its brow. In bas relief, the enormous figures of Stonewall Jackson, Robert E. Lee, and Jefferson Davis. Not far from its base is the apartment we lived in that last year at the 5400 block of Memorial, number 18D. Though I knew exactly where it was, knew the landmarks leading up to it, I drove right past it first and had to double back to enter the tree-lined front gate. From there, I could see Stone Mountain in the distance, suddenly visible where Memorial crests, as if to remind me what is remembered here and what is not. I keep an image in my head of myself from that first day after her death at the apartment. There's a video recording of my arrival made by a local news station. And so the image is not only of those few moments, but of watching myself from a distance, entering my former life for what I thought to be the last time. In the footage, I walk up the stairs to the door and step in, shutting it behind me. When I think of it now, I don't hear any words, the volume on mute. Perhaps the reporter spoke our names, or perhaps she did not, calling my mother victim instead. And in my mind's eye, a caption fills the bottom of the screen. It identifies me as daughter of the murdered woman. Even then, I felt as though I were watching someone else, a young woman on the cusp of her life, adulthood and bereavement gripping her at once. The young woman I'd become, walking out of that apartment hours later, was not the same one who went into it. It's as if she's still there, that girl I was, behind the closed door, locked in the footage where it ends. Often I have seen that doorway in my dreams. Only now is it a threshold I can cross. The first chapter begins with an epigraph from Shakespeare's Sonnet number 3. Thou art thy mother's glass, and she in thee calls back the lovely April of her prime. Another country. There is a large birthmark on the back of my thigh. Even though it has been with me over half a century, I can't recall which leg bears its dark outline, and so I have to look at myself backward in a mirror to remember. Seeing it is not unlike encountering a forgotten scar, a remnant that recalls the moment of wounding. It takes me back to my early childhood, the long, warm days in Mississippi when I wore shorts much of the time and the birthmark was plainly visible, not hidden as it usually is now. Though not the shape of a hand, it is the size of one, and in exactly the spot where, If you were told to sit on your hands, as my mother was, you might leave a mark. Across cultures, myths abound about the imprint a mother can make even before her child crosses the threshold into the world. The way her desires or fears can be manifest on the body. Birthmarks in the shape or color of food she craved. A lock of gray hair where she tugged at her own. To stanch the cravings, they say, eat a bit of dirt or clay. To steady the hand that worries the hair, sit on it. Had my mother done any of this, there might have been a single story in my family about what my birthmark symbolizes. The only thing the elders agreed on was that it looked like a place on a map, somewhere my mother might have dreamed of, but had never been. I've often imagined her anticipating my arrival, both hopeful and anxious about the world, the particular time and place I would enter, a fierce longing taking shape inside her. In the spring of 1966, when I was born, my mother was a couple of months shy of her 22nd birthday. My father was out of town, traveling for work, so she made the short trip from my grandmother's house to Gulfport Memorial Hospital as planned without him. On her way to the segregated ward, she could not help but take in the tenor of the day, witnessing the barrage of rebel flags lining the streets, private citizens, lawmakers, Klansmen, often one and the same, raising them in Gulfport and small towns all across Mississippi. The 26th of April that year marked the 100th anniversary of Mississippi's celebration of Confederate Memorial Day, a holiday glorifying the Old South, the lost cause, and white supremacy. And much of the fervor was a display, too, in opposition to recent advancements in the civil rights movement. She could not have missed the paradox of my birth on that particular day, a child of miscegenation, an interracial marriage still illegal in Mississippi and in as many as 20 other states. Sequestered on the colored floor, my mother knew the country was changing, but slowly. She had come of age in the summer of 1965, turning 21 in the wake of Bloody Sunday, the Watts riots, and years of racially motivated murders in Mississippi. Unlike my father, who'd grown up a white boy in rural Nova Scotia, hunting and fishing, free to roam the open woods, my mother had come into being a Black girl in the Deep South, hemmed in, bound to a world circumscribed by Jim Crow. Though my father believed in the idea of living dangerously, the necessity of taking risks, my mother had witnessed the necessity of dissembling, the art of making of one's face an inscrutable mask before whites who expected of Blacks a servile deference. In the summer of 1955, when she was 11 years old, she'd seen what could happen to a Black child in Mississippi who had not behaved as expected, stepping outside the confines of racial prescription. In my grandmother's copy of Jet magazine, Emmett Till's battered remains, his destroyed face. Even had my mother wanted to ignore the racial violence and increasing turbulence around her, my grandmother would not allow it. In her house, the latest issue of Jet lay on the coffee table beside a book of documentary photographs of the civil rights movement, images ranging from lynchings to peaceful protests and the resilient faces of Black Americans, constant reminders of the necessity of fighting for justice in a state where the external reminders were increasingly unavoidable. The year before my mother met my father, the civil rights activist Medgar Evers had been gunned down in his driveway in Jackson. That year, 1963, my grandmother joined a group of Black citizens in the Biloxi Wade-In to protest being denied the right to use the public beaches. To mourn Evers, The protesters placed hundreds of black flags in the sand, an image my mother, watching from the seawall, would not forget. Nor would she forget hearing the news of the 3 civil rights activists working on the Freedom Summer campaign to register Black voters in Mississippi. James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner had been abducted and murdered in June 1964, their bodies found 2 months later, buried under the weight of an earthen berm in Neshoba County. When the news reached her, my mother was out of the state on a field trip with her college theater group. Back home, the Ku Klux Klan had initiated its campaign of terror, the Mississippi she returned to having grown even more frightening. That summer was a season of fires, of danger coming ever closer, flaming crosses and Black churches burning all around the state. My mother and grandmother, living across the street from a church, slept less soundly then, awakening often in the night to listen. It was against that backdrop of imminence and upheaval that my parents, both college students at the time, fell in love. They met in a literature course on modern drama, and their conversations on books and theater propelled them from the classroom out into the afternoon sunlight as they walked the campus and beyond among the rolling green hills of Kentucky. When they eloped in 1965, traveling across the Ohio River into Cincinnati, where it was legal for them to be married, only my mother fully understood what this might mean for me, the child she was already carrying. In letters to my father during their months apart, she was at once sanguine and practical, hopeful for a changing nation, but also aware that any child she brought into the world would have much to learn in order to be safe. That meant I would need to understand the realities I would face, the painful, oppressive facts of a place slow to accept integration, even as it was now the law of the land. My father, idealistic in nature, was still naive enough to believe I could grow up free of the burdens of race, of Blackness, that is, as he was. They complemented each other, as opposites do. My mother, graceful and reserved, attentive to details. My father, with his rough manners, rowdy and bookish at once, often distracted by his thoughts. It was my mother who stanched the blood on my cheek when, after watching my father shaving, I tried using his straight razor. It had been my father, absent-minded, who'd left the razor on the counter within my reach. One day, when I cut my knee in the ditch outside, revealing what appeared to be a layer of white skin underneath, I lay between them, holding their hands up side by side, asking why they weren't the same color, why I didn't match either of them exactly. What was I? You have the best of both worlds, they told me, not for the first time. Out in the world, alone with either of them, I was just beginning to feel a profound sense of dislocation. If I was with my father, I measured the polite responses from white people, the way they addressed him as sir or mister, whereas my mother would be called gal, never miss or ma'am, as I had been taught was proper. So different was the treatment I received with each of them that I was unsure where or how I belonged. Only at home, the 3 of us together, did I feel profoundly theirs. And in that trinity of mother, father, and child, I would shut my eyes and fall asleep on the high bed between them. When I began to go out with both my parents, outside of the confines of North Gulfport to a store or the movie theater, I watched the ways white people responded to us. That my parents were beautiful would have been reason enough to stare. But in Mississippi, in the late 60s and early 70s, It had been only a few years since the beaches were integrated to comply with national law, and the schools were yet to be fully desegregated across the state. Ross Barnett, the former governor, was monitoring interracial activity, and my grandmother had been on the list of people to watch ever since she tried to place my parents' 1965 wedding announcement in the local newspaper. Separation of the races was still the way of things, maintained by custom, if not upheld by law. And my parents and I met with a great deal of hostility most places we went. I could see it on the faces of the white people we encountered, how even the nicer ones just shook their heads, whispering, "Such a cute little thing. Too bad she's black." How others just stared at us, sucking their teeth. Sometimes this hostility turned to outright intimidation, someone following us out of Woolworths to the car, my mother gripping my father's arm to prevent him turning around and engaging the man behind us, someone else driving slowly by the house, glaring at us as we sat on the front porch, a group of 3 or 4 men accosting my father on his way home from work on the docks, asking, "What's wrong with you? Why you living among the niggers?" My mother and grandmother, having lived with this kind of attention, were accustomed to scrutiny and intimidation. A stream of headlights searching the front windows of the house at night, the sexually charged calls from white men driving by in broad daylight. In the late 50s and early 60s, my grandmother had given shelter to several Mennonite missionaries who came to North Gulfport to teach, repair the dilapidated housing of the very poor, and minister to the community. For weeks at a time, these young white missionaries would stay at her house, and it wasn't long before their presence and the work they were doing was noticed by local whites. First, there was a bomb threat directed at the Bible camp where the Mennonites were believed to be promoting integration, the camp my mother attended. Then the Ku Klux Klan threatened to bomb the Mount Olive Baptist Church across the street. Undeterred, my grandmother began to sleep with a pistol beneath her pillow. In spite of the danger, she was adamant in her belief that she must do this work, must open her doors to help, a moral obligation, she called it. Though my grandmother and my mother met all of this with a similar stoicism, they responded differently. My mother was averse to guns, to confrontation, whereas my grandmother saw guns as a necessity, telling me countless times the way to confront a would-be intruder. "First, fire a warning shot," she said, "and if they keep coming, aim at the legs, shoot to wound." Those words marked my first awareness that any danger we might face was not limited to the world outside our close-knit community, the radius of those houses, but could come right up to us, right up into the yard, perhaps even the front door. Though I was too young to recall the night the Klan burned a cross in our driveway, I heard the story again and again, and the night lives in my memory as experience. I see it as though watching a scene in a documentary, silent but for the metal box fan in the window, a whirring sound like an old movie projector. The men arrived late in the evening, long after supper, my parents still sitting together in the den watching television. My grandmother and my Uncle Charlie in the kitchen washing the last of the dishes, all of them dead now. I see them moving through the house like ghosts. Even I am a ghost in this story, an infant self of whom I have no recollection, my inscrutable face still white as my father's. My grandmother peers through the blinds at the group of them, 7 or 8 men in white robes carrying a man-sized cross. In the bedroom, my mother watches over me, the blackout curtains drawn, all the lights in the house extinguished so that, but for the faint glow of a hurricane lamp in the corner, we are all in darkness. My father and uncle, rifles in hand, waiting silently in the front room as outside the fire ignites. This is a poem about that moment. It's called Incident, and it's a pantoum, which means each line is repeated a second time in a new order in the poem. Incident. We tell the story every year, how we peered from the windows, shades drawn, though nothing really happened, the charred grass now green again. We peered from the windows, shades drawn, at the cross trussed like a Christmas tree, the charred grass still green. Then we darkened our rooms, lit the hurricane lamps. At the cross trussed like a Christmas tree, a few men gathered, white as angels in their gowns. We darkened our rooms and lit hurricane lamps, the wicks trembling in their fonts of oil. It seemed the angels had gathered, white men in their gowns. When they were done, they left quietly. No one came. The wicks trembled all night in their fonts of oil. By morning, the flames had all dimmed. When they were done, the men left quietly. No one came. Nothing really happened. By morning, all the flames had dimmed. We tell the story every year. And I'm going to close with one last poem that returns to that dream that I read in the beginning, the image from that dream. It's an ekphrastic poem, which means it responds to a work of art. And that work of art is Miguel Cabrera's Portrait of Saint Gertrude, from 1763. Articulation. In the legend, Saint Gertrude is called to write after seeing in a vision the Sacred Heart of Christ. Cabrera paints her among the instruments of her faith. Quill, inkwell, an open book, rings on her fingers like Christ's many wounds, the heart emblazoned on her chest, the holy infant nestled there as if sunk deep in a wound. Against the dark backdrop, her face is a wafer of light. How not to see in the saint's image my mother's last portrait, the dark backdrop, her dress black as a habit, the bright edge of her afro ringing her face with light. And how not to recall her many wounds, ring finger shattered, her ex-husband's bullet finding her temple, lodging where her last thought lodged. 3 weeks gone, my mother came to me in a dream, her body whole again, but for one perfect wound, the singular articulation of all of them, a whole center of her forehead, the size of a wafer, light pouring from it. How then could I not answer her life with mine, she who saved me with hers? And how could I not bathe in the light of her wound, find my calling there? Thank you.
Wow, that was wonderful. Thank you for sharing those with us, Natasha. I want to encourage people to put their questions in the Q&A box, and we will ask them, Natasha. But we will start with a few discussions while everyone is maybe thinking of those. So tell us, you've written several books of poetry, and that's really been what you've known for. Why a memoir, and what made you decide to do something and tell such private thoughts and troubles?
Well, after my own work began to garner a lot of attention, after the Pulitzer, after being appointed United States Poet Laureate, I was being written about a lot in newspapers and magazines. And when I was written about, there was often a bit of my backstory that came into a piece. And in the backstory, a small mention of my mother, barely an afterthought, as a victim, a murdered woman. And it really began to sort of eat away at me, because she was being mentioned as if, as an afterthought, she had no important role in me becoming the writer that I am. And so I decided that if she was going to be mentioned, that I was going to be the one to tell her story, our story, and to put her role in my life in its proper perspective.
Yeah, I can see how that would inspire you to do that. So your book really speaks so much of family. Tell us a little bit about your extended family. You talked about your grandmother and what you read, and how that really influenced you. And you talk about almost them protecting you from the realities of the world.
I had a very tight-knit extended family. In that chapter, I go on to talk about my grandmother's siblings, my great uncle's son and his wife, Lizzie, who lived right across the highway from my grandmother, my great aunt Sugar, who lived right next door to my grandmother, and that little radius of family members that I could travel between, and sort of enjoy a kind of focused attention, because I was an only child from all of them. My great aunt Sugar had moved to Chicago during the part of the Great Migration, but when I was born, she moved back to Mississippi so she could be around to help take care of me during the day when my parents were at work. My grandmother had worked in a drapery factory up until the day I was born, and quit her job and started her own business as a drapery seamstress out of her home so that she could be home with me. When I went to Head Start, where my mother worked in administration, my great uncle's son, who owned a lot of property in the community as well as a baseball team that my father played on, he drove the school bus and picked me up first and dropped me off last. So I was with my uncle's son on my way to school, where my mother also worked, and then on the way home. So I was constantly surrounded by them. I think in many ways that allowed me to be prepared to survive the trauma that would come later. I think it inculcated in me a sense of fierce love and resilience.
Yes, it speaks to the importance of family and those early years of our lives, definitely. So, really, the memoir is almost part mystery and part a story of grief. We know what's going to happen when we're reading it, yet there's still suspense. How did you create that?
Um, first of all, I did want the reader to know from the very beginning, as you say, that my mother was murdered, that she was gone, so that the book would not be some big reveal to that moment of her death in 1985. I think that the way that I was still able to create a kind of suspense is that the book doesn't exactly move completely linearly. I mean, it moves in a linear fashion, but there's moments where it circles back to certain images or scenes from before. And also, in so doing, what I hope to create was a sense in the reader that even though you know this is going to happen, you hope on every page that she survives it. I think that also creates some of the dramatic unfolding and the suspense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I don't want to give away part of the ending, but you do talk about surviving trauma and how that impacted your life. There's a quote that says, "To survive trauma, one must be able to tell a story about it." Did telling this story help you?
I think the extent to which it feels like it helps is that my mother's not the footnote anymore. I think so many more people who've read this book know about her and how remarkable she was.
Mm-hmm.
That's the help that I needed. So in that way, yes, writing it doesn't lessen the burden of grief that I carry with me all the time. I think that doesn't go away. But I do feel buoyed by the fact that people are reading this and know who she was.
And she was a remarkable woman. And I was so touched by the time when you came home and were going to be writing for the school magazine, and she took such a risk in telling your stepfather no, he didn't want you to, and she's saying no, she will, regardless of what may happen. She truly was thinking of you and putting you first. Is that where you got your love of writing? Did that encouragement really helps spark the poet in you?
Well, my father was also a poet. And so between the two of them, there was a great deal of nurturing the possibilities of telling my own story. From a very early age, my father told me that I would need to be a writer because I would have something important to say. And when my father said that, at that time, what he meant was growing up Black and biracial in Mississippi, being born in a time when once it was no longer illegal in the eyes of the law, it was still frowned upon and illegitimate in terms of custom and the expectations that people had about interracial couples and interracial biracial people. So he thought, that was obviously going to be something that I would have to say. And my mother nurtured whatever early talent that she saw in me. I mean, I began writing poems in the 3rd grade. I wrote short stories, a novella when I was about 10 years old. And she nurtured all of that, and I think protected it. The scene that you mentioned, when I'm in high school and I'm so excited, I've come home and I've decided that I'm going to be a writer, and he tells me that I'm not going to do any of that. She takes a risk to say she will do whatever she wants, in spite of what she knows he will do to her for pushing back.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, we are so glad that you told your mother's story. It definitely is a story that needs to be told. Her courage and just in her whole life, the challenges she faced and met with such grace. So thank you for putting that on paper and for being with us today. You can see in the chat box, everybody mentions how impactful it was to read that. And we really appreciate your time with us today, and hope maybe sometime you can get down to Chattanooga with your next book. You have another book of poetry coming out, huh? You have another book of poetry?
Thank you, Linda.
Yeah.
I am working on one.
Great. Well, we look forward to it. Okay. So thank you for your time.